My name is Daniel Whitaker. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent my entire life in a family where there was only ever one son that mattered. 3 weeks ago, after my parents were buried, my older brother told me exactly where I stood. We were in the driveway of the house we grew up in. The funeral flowers were still fresh inside. He looked at me the same way our father used to when I disappointed him, without even trying. Dad decided this a long time ago. He said, "The firstborn carries the name. The firstborn inherits. That's how it's always been in this family." I didn't answer. He held my gaze a second longer, then added, "You were never built for this legacy, Daniel." 2 days later, he changed the locks. The house in Richmond, the 4-bedroom colonial with the red brick porch. The place where I spent the last 2 years driving our mother to chemo while he visited 3 times. The place where I slept on the recliner beside her hospital bed while he checked his Rolex and talked about expansion deals. He didn't wait for the will reading. He had my things boxed and stacked on the lawn like inventory that had expired. "You'll land somewhere," he told me. "You always do." But here's what my brother didn't know. For 8 years, my mother had been preparing for this exact moment. And she didn't prepare for him. She prepared for me. It had rained that afternoon. Not a storm. Just enough to soak through cardboard and make everything sag. My paramedic jacket was half out of one box, sleeves dragging in the mud. My frame certification from the Virginia EMS board had warped at the edges. The corner of my high school baseball photo bled blue ink into the paper like it was dissolving in real time. Inside the house, through the front window, I could see Ethan walking across the living room. Hugo Boss suit, perfect posture, his movements controlled, deliberate, like he already owned the air. He did own it now, or at least he thought he did. He opened the door just long enough to say what he'd clearly rehearsed. "You don't need to make this dramatic, Daniel." I didn't move. He glanced down at my watch, my father's old Timex, the one he tossed to me when he upgraded to something heavier, sheenier, worth more. Ethan adjusted his Rolex. "That's the difference between us," he said quietly. "I build. You respond to emergencies." Behind him, Claire, his wife, stood in the foyer holding a wine glass. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She looked through me. "You were always temporary," Ethan continued. "Dad knew that. I know that. Deep down. You do too." Nothing in my face changed, but something in my chest did. Not anger. Recognition. He just said out loud what I'd lived with for 32 years. And he thought that was the end of it. Before I go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been the other sibling? Not the favorite? Not the heir. Just the one expected to adapt. If this story feels familiar, if you've ever stood in the rain while someone else rewrote your place in the family, take a second and hit subscribe. Only if it means something to you. And tell me where you're watching from. City and local time. I read every comment. Because what happened next at the will reading wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it changed everything. Now, to understand why my brother was so certain I'd walk away with nothing, you need to understand the Whitaker family. To understand what happened in that conference room, you have to understand my father. Thomas Whitaker built houses across central Virginia for 35 years. Custom builds, subdivisions, small commercial projects. Not flashy money, but solid money. The kind that comes from knowing how to pour a foundation straight and finish what you start. He believed in structure, in hierarchy, in roles. The firstborn carries the weight. He used to say, the rest support the load. Ethan absorbed that like oxygen. 6 years older than me. He grew up in Dad's truck, job sites on Saturdays, blueprint lessons at the kitchen table. When he graduated high school, Dad paid for his business degree at VCU without hesitation. When Ethan wanted to pivot into real estate development, Dad introduced him to every investor, contractor, and bank contact he'd ever worked with. Doors opened before Ethan even knocked. Me, I liked sirens. I liked the idea of showing up when something was already broken. When I said I wanted to become a paramedic, Dad didn't yell. He just nodded once. Good steady work, he said. Not leadership, but steady. That was his way of categorizing me. Not the heir, not the builder, not the future. Steady. Mom Carol Whitaker was the center that kept everything from splitting in half. She didn't argue with Dad's philosophy. She softened it, smoothed it over like grout between uneven tiles. She planted lavender along the back fence the year I turned 10, said it kept the air calm. She never contradicted Dad publicly. But when he'd praise Ethan's first six-figure closing and forget to mention I'd passed my national registry exam, she'd squeeze my shoulder in the kitchen later. "I see you," she'd say quietly. That meant more than he probably understood. Ethan didn't think he was favored. That's the thing about golden children, they rarely do. To him, he had simply earned everything. Worked harder, thought bigger, played the game correctly. When I was pulling double shifts in EMT school, he was attending investor dinners. When I bought my used Ford pickup outright with savings, he was leasing a BMW with projected commissions. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, Claire asked me while Mom was still well enough to cook if I'd ever considered scaling up. "You can't ride in ambulances forever," she said lightly. Mom's fork paused midair. "I'm not scaling," I answered. "I'm serving." Ethan smirked. "Exactly," he said. That night, in the hallway, outside the kitchen, I overheard him say something that stayed with me. "Don't worry," he told Claire. "Dad's already structured everything. I'm covered. Daniel won't contest. He's not built for that." I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. But I remembered. Because in our family, its structure wasn't just about houses. It was about inheritance. And I had never been part of the blueprint. 2 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. I was on shift when Dad called. He never called me at work. The only reason my phone buzzed was because I'd programmed it to override silent mode if it was family. "Your mother's sick," he said. No build-up, no softness. "You need to come home." Not "we need you." Just "you need to come home." Like it had always been my assignment. I'd transferred to a station 15 minutes from the house within the week. Switched to night shifts, so I could take her to oncology during the day. Chemo on Tuesdays. Radiation on Fridays. Blood work in between. Cancer strips dignity before it takes anything else. I shaved her head when the clumps started falling out in the shower. She didn't cry. I didn't either. I just wrapped the towel around her shoulders and told her she looked tactical. She laughed at that. Ethan visited 3 times in 2 years. 3? Each visit lasted less than an hour. He'd pull into the driveway in whatever car he was leasing at the time. Hug Mom carefully, like she might stain his jacket, and glance at his Rolex before mentioning a deal he was closing. "I wish I could stay longer," he'd say. "You know how it is." I did know how it was. It meant I was the one lifting her when neuropathy made her legs unreliable. I was the one cleaning up when the nausea hit too fast. I was the one sleeping in the recliner beside her hospital bed when she couldn't breathe flat. My paycheck dropped almost 20% when I reduced overtime. Ethan never noticed. Dad never thanked me. In his mind, this was simply redistribution of labor. The non-air handling the non-profitable responsibilities. But Mom noticed. She started asking me to drive her to an office downtown once a month. Said it was insurance paperwork. I didn't question it. I'd drop her off in front of a brick building in Richmond, wait in the truck, and scroll through shift schedules until she came back out. Every time she returned, she seemed lighter, not healthier, just steadier. One night, when I was helping her settle into bed after a rough chemo cycle, she grabbed my wrist before I could pull away. "You always show up," she said. I shrugged. "That's the job." "No," she said firmly. "That's who you are." I didn't know what to say to that. She looked tired. Not physically, something deeper. Like someone finishing a calculation in their head. "Whatever happens," she added, "remember this. You did everything right." At the time, I thought she meant the treatment, the prognosis, the fight. I didn't understand she was balancing a ledger. Because caregiving isn't loud. It doesn't get applause. It doesn't come with equity shares or press releases. It's invisible work. But Mom was keeping score. And somewhere between chemo appointments and quiet meetings with a lawyer I hadn't met yet, she was building something. Not out of anger, out of correction. Ethan believed inheritance was about bloodline and birth order. Mom believed it was about presence. And she was planning accordingly. 6 weeks ago, Mom was declared cancer-free. I was in the oncologist's office when the doctor said the word remission. I didn't react at first. I'd learned not to celebrate too early. But Mom smiled slow, careful, like she didn't want to scare it away. We had lunch at her favorite cafe that afternoon. She ordered iced tea instead of water for the first time in 2 years. "I want to see Grandma Ruth," she said. "Your father's been saying he'll take me. I'm tired of waiting." 4 weeks ago, he finally did. They were driving back from Charlottesville when a freight truck drifted across lanes on I-64. The state trooper told me it was instant. I was halfway through a night shift when my captain called me off the rig. His face told me before his mouth did. I walked into the hospital stairwell because I couldn't breathe in the hallway. Concrete steps, fluorescent light humming above me. My phone slipped out of my hand and hit the floor while the Virginia State Police were still talking. I don't remember the drive home. I remember pulling into the driveway at 3:12 a.m. The porch light was still on. The lavender along the fence moved in the wind like nothing had changed. That was the worst part. The house was exactly the same. Everything else wasn't. The funeral was 4 days later. 80 people. Ethan gave the eulogy. He spoke about Dad's legacy for 7 minutes. He mentioned Mom twice. By the time the reception ended, I understood something. The accident didn't just take my parents. It removed the last barrier between Ethan and the inheritance he believed was already his. The funeral flowers were still alive when Ethan pulled me aside in the church vestibule. Stained glass threw red and blue light across his face. He kept his voice low. "We need to talk about the house." I was still holding a folded program from the service. "We haven't read the will yet." I said, "The will's procedural." He replied, "Dad made his position clear years ago. He adjusted his cufflinks, polished, measured. You have until the end of the week to move your things out." I stared at him. "I've been living there for 2 years. You chose to." He said, "No one asked you to put your life on hold." Put my life on hold. I didn't argue. Not there. Not in the church. But he didn't wait a week. 2 days later, I came home from shift just before 7 p.m. My key didn't work. I tried it again. Slower. Same result. Deadbolt replaced. I walked around back. My belongings were stacked under the eaves like overflow inventory. Rain had already soaked through the bottom boxes. My boots, my clothes, my EMT textbooks from a decade ago. Mom's old recipe binder she'd handed me last Thanksgiving. Through the living room window, I saw Claire crossing the floor with a glass of wine. She noticed me, paused, raised the glass slightly. Not a toast. An acknowledgement. I called Ethan. He picked up immediately. "The property is legally under my control," he said. "My attorney confirmed it. We haven't even had the reading. You're not contesting anything. Daniel, don't embarrass yourself. I grew up there, and now you don't live there." Silence stretched between us. Then he shifted tone. "I'm willing to help you transition," he said. $10,000. Cash. You sign a non-contest agreement before the reading. Clean break. 10,000. For 2 years of lifting our mother out of bed. For 32 years of being secondary. Keep it. I said. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I replied. "You are." He exhaled sharply. "You're walking into that will reading with nothing. Remember that." The line went dead. I stood in the wet grass a long time after. Not because I didn't know where to go. Because I finally understood something. He wasn't bluffing. He believed I had already lost. I loaded what I could into my truck before the rain picked up again. Most of it was replaceable. Clothes, books, equipment. One box wasn't. Mom's gardening gloves, a stack of old photographs. And at the bottom, a cream-colored envelope with my name written in her handwriting. "For Daniel when the time comes." I didn't open it there. Not in the driveway. Not under Ethan's security cameras. I drove to the only place that felt neutral, the station parking lot after shift change. Sat in the cab with the engine off. The world quiet for once. My hands weren't shaking. They were steady. That scared me more. Inside, the paper was thin, her writing smaller than I remembered. "Daniel, Stam, if you're reading this, then what I worried about has happened." I stopped breathing for a second. I saw it. I always saw it. Your father loved you in his way, but he believed in hierarchy more than fairness. I couldn't change him, but I could prepare for the aftermath. At the bottom was a name. Margaret Harlow, Harlow and Price. Richmond. She has everything. All documents. All arrangements. Do not argue. Do not sign anything. Just wait. You were never second. You were simply quieter. I love you more than lavender and morning light. Mom. I read it twice. Then I looked at the number written beneath the firm's name. 8 years. 8 years she'd been building something I didn't know existed. Ethan thought he'd changed the locks. He hadn't realized my mother had already changed the structure. Harlow and Price occupied a renovated brick townhouse 3 blocks from the courthouse in downtown Richmond. Old wood floors, brass nameplates, the kind of place that smelled like paper and patience. I showed up in clean jeans and a pressed flannel. Didn't try to look like someone who belonged there. Didn't try to look like someone who didn't. Margaret Harlow met me herself. Late 50s. Silver hair cut sharp at the jawline. Navy suit. No wasted movement. Daniel Whitaker, she said, extending her hand. I've been expecting you. Her grip was firm, measured. We sat in her office, shelves lined with estate volumes, binders stacked in deliberate order. Your mother was meticulous, she began. We worked together for 8 years. 8. Same timeline as the quiet monthly drives. Same timeline as the shift in her eyes. She understood your father's philosophy. Margaret continued carefully. She also understood your brother's expectations. I didn't interrupt. She knew what would happen if everything passed strictly through your father's estate, that I'd be boxed out. I said. Margaret didn't smile, but she didn't deny it either. She prepared alternative instruments. Instruments outside probate. Outside your father's direct control. My chest stayed still. What kind of instruments? The kind we'll discuss formally at the will reading, she replied. Both estates will be addressed together. I leaned back slightly. So I wait. Yes. No reacting. No signing anything. Her eyes sharpened. Has your brother offered you money? 10,000. She nodded once. Like she predicted the number exactly. That was anticipated. That stopped me. Anticipated. Your mother requested that if any pressure was applied before the reading, if you be instructed to decline. Calmly. I exhaled through my nose. Trust me, Margaret said. Not softly. Not emotionally. Just as a directive. Do I need to contest anything? No. That answer carried weight. Daniel, she added, folding her hands. Your mother did not spend 8 years improvising. For the first time since the lock change, something shifted inside me. Not hope. Certainty. Will he know? I asked. Not until it's read aloud. I stood to leave. Ethan thought he was walking into a confirmation. Margaret knew he was walking into a correction. And I was walking in without saying a word. The will reading was scheduled for Thursday at 2:00 p.m. at Harlow and Price. The conference room was understated. Dark wood table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Richmond. Quiet money kind of room. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early. Gray tailored suit, Rolex polished, controlled expression. Claire beside him, and phone face down for once. I took a seat across from them. Margaret Harlow entered with a slim folder in her hand. Late 50s. Silver hair cut sharp at the jaw. The kind of presence that didn't need volume. For the record, she began. We will be reading 2 wills today. Thomas Whitaker's and Carol Whitaker's. Ethan leaned back. Let's start with Dad's, he said. We already know how this goes. Margaret opened the first folder. Last will and testament of Thomas Edward Whitaker. Dated 14 months prior to his death. The legal language rolled forward. Executor appointments, debt settlements, personal effects. Then she reached the distribution clause. To my son, Ethan Thomas Whitaker, I leave 70% of my personal assets, including my business interests, vehicles, workshop equipment, and all accounts held jointly with my spouse. Ethan didn't smile immediately. He let it settle first. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. Margaret continued. To my son, Daniel James Whitaker, I leave 30% of my remaining personal assets. Claire's fingers moved slightly on the table calculating. Margaret glanced at her notes. After liabilities and estate costs, the remaining liquid value is approximately $85,000. Claire exhaled softly. Ethan turned toward me. 30% of that is roughly $25,000, he said calmly. Not insignificant. He folded his hands. That's more than fair. I didn't respond. Margaret closed the first folder. That concludes Thomas Whitaker's estate. Ethan sat straighter now. The tension in his shoulders had evaporated. He had what he came for: majority control. The company shares. The tools. The accounts. The narrative was intact. See, he said quietly. Almost conversational. I tried to make this easier for you. I met his eyes. You tried to buy me out. I tried to avoid conflict. Claire leaned forward slightly. This is what your father wanted. Daniel. It's not personal. Not personal. 70% to the heir. 30% to the spare. The blueprint held. Ethan adjusted his watch. The house falls under Dad's estate as well, he said confidently, which means we can proceed with listing it once paperwork clears. Margaret didn't respond to that. Instead, she placed her hand on the second folder. Ethan noticed the motion but dismissed it. Let's not drag this out, he said. Mom didn't have independent holdings. Everything meaningful was structured jointly. Margaret's expression did not change. That assumption, she said evenly, is incorrect. The air in the room shifted, subtle but noticeable. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly. My mother was a homemaker, he said. She didn't have separate assets. Margaret looked at him steadily. Your mother had her own estate, Mr. Whitaker, and it is substantially larger than your father's. For the first time that afternoon, Ethan didn't have a response ready. Claire blinked. What does that mean, she asked. Margaret opened the second folder. It means we're not finished. Ethan leaned back again, but the posture wasn't relaxed this time. Fine, he said. Let's hear it. He still believed he was in control. He believed the 70% had secured the future. He believed the hierarchy had been confirmed in writing. And for one long moment, sitting there with $25,000 to my name and nothing else visible on the table, I let him believe it. Because this was the part where he thought he'd already won. Margaret Harlow didn't rush. She let the silence settle after Ethan's last sentence. Then she opened the second folder. Last will and testament of Carolyn Whitaker, she began, voice steady. Updated 18 months prior to her passing. Executed under full cognitive evaluation by Dr. Leonard Hayes, board-certified psychiatrist. Documentation included. Ethan's eyes narrowed. 18 months ago, he said. She was in camo. She was also evaluated independently. Margaret replied. The medical affidavit confirms full competency at the time of signing. Additionally, the execution was recorded on video per Mrs. Whitaker's request. She placed a small USB drive on the table. She anticipated the possibility of contest. Claire's fingers stopped moving. Margaret removed a single sheet of cream paper. Your mother asked that a portion of this be read aloud. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Let's just get to the numbers. Margaret didn't look at him. To my sons, she read. Love does not mean blindness. I saw the imbalance in this house. I saw who was expected to inherit and who was expected to adapt. I could not change your father's beliefs, but I could correct the outcome. Ethan shifted in his chair. Margaret continued. Daniel showed up. Not once. Not when it was convenient. He showed up every day. The assets I leave him are not favoritism. They are equity. Claire's jaw tightened. Margaret set the letter down. Now we will address the assets within Mrs. Whitaker's independent estate. Ethan leaned forward. The house, he said firmly, is part of Dad's holdings. Margaret slid a document across the table. 5 years ago, the deed to 214 Oak Hollow Drive was transferred from joint ownership into Carol Whitaker's sole name. Ethan stared at the paper. That's not possible. It is recorded with the Henrico County Land Registry. Margaret replied. Executed during a period when Mr. Whitaker's contracting firm faced potential litigation. The transfer was advised for asset protection. Claire's voice came out thin. And it was never transferred back. No. Margaret folded her hands. The property, currently appraised at approximately $680,000, belonged solely to Carol Whitaker at the time of her death. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. And per her will, Margaret continued. The property transfers in full to Daniel James Whitaker. The words landed without drama, but they hit. That's, Ethan swallowed. That's procedural. That can be challenged. No, Margaret said evenly. The deed was clean. The ownership was sole. It does not pass through Thomas Whitaker's estate. Silence. Then, Margaret reached for another document. 8 years ago, Carol Whitaker established an irrevocable trust. Claire blinked. I'm sorry, what an irrevocable trust? Margaret repeated. Funded initially with a $450,000 gift from Ruth Whitaker, Daniel, and Ethan's grandmother. Ethan turned toward me. You knew about this, I didn't answer. Because I hadn't. Margaret continued. The trust was invested conservatively in indexed equities and bonds over the past 8 years. She glanced at her tablet. The current valuation stands at approximately $1,310,000. Claire's breath hitched. That's impossible. It is not. Dad would never have allowed The funds were never his. Margaret interrupted calmly. They were separate property. They were never commingled with marital assets. He had no legal authority over them. Ethan's composure cracked slightly. So what? She just built a separate fortune in secret, yes. Margaret said. The word didn't carry emotion. It didn't need to. And because the trust is irrevocable, she continued, it exists outside probate. It is not contestable through the will. Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling like he was recalculating something invisible. Margaret wasn't finished. There is also a life insurance policy through Northwestern Mutual, she said. Face value $500,000. Claire turned toward Ethan slowly. Beneficiary, she asked. Daniel James Whitaker. Margaret replied. I felt my pulse once in my throat. Then it settled. Ethan laughed once short. Hollow. You're telling me, he said, voice tightening, that Mom left him over $2 million. Margaret didn't correct the math. She finalized it. House $680,000. Irrevocable trust $1,310,000. Life insurance $500,000. Plus 30% of Thomas Whitaker's liquid assets, approximately $25,000. She looked directly at Ethan. Total estimated transfer to Daniel $2,515,000. The number filled the room. Ethan gripped the edge of the table. Claire whispered something I couldn't hear. This is fraud. Ethan said finally. She wasn't in her right mind. Margaret tapped the USB drive lightly. The video recording is available for review. In it, your mother explains each decision in detail. She anticipated this reaction. She can't cut me out. She did not cut you out. Margaret replied. You inherit 70% of your father's estate. Business holdings. Equipment. Accounts. That's not equivalent. No. Margaret agreed. It is not. The truth hung there. Ethan's breathing changed shallower now. Claire's voice came sharp. This is insane. Daniel's a paramedic. He works shift rotations. He doesn't manage assets. Margaret's gaze didn't move. Competence in emergency medicine does not disqualify someone from receiving inheritance. Claire flushed. Ethan stood abruptly. She promised, he said hoarsely. Dad promised. Margaret didn't respond to promises. She responded to documents. There is one final note. She added, Mrs. Whitaker included a clause addressing any attempt to contest. Should either party initiate litigation against the estate without merit, they forfeit additional discretionary provisions. Ethan froze up. What discretionary provisions? Margaret held his gaze. Exactly. The room went still. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan's hand slipped from the table. His face drained of color. He swayed once. Claire stood halfway out of her chair. Ethan, he tried to say something. Nothing came out. Then he collapsed. His shoulder clipped the side of the table before he hit the floor. Claire screamed. Margaret's assistant was already dialing 911. I didn't move. I watched. Not with satisfaction. Not with anger. With recognition. For 38 years, Ethan had lived inside a structure that guaranteed his elevation. And in less than 10 minutes, that structure had been replaced with something he couldn't argue. Outtalk. Or intimidate. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. Syncopal episode, they said. Sudden drop in blood pressure, triggered by acute stress. Nothing fatal. Just shock. They lifted him onto the stretcher. Claire followed. Mascara streaking. Phone forgotten on the table. Margaret closed the folders calmly. The documents will be processed immediately, she said to me. Title transfer. Trust access. Insurance disbursement. I nodded once. No celebration. No speech. Just a quiet recalibration. 8 years of planning. 2 minutes of reading. And the hierarchy that had shaped my entire life dissolved under notarized paper. Mom hadn't screamed. She hadn't confronted. She had corrected. And she'd done it in ink. Ethan refused the ambulance. By the time the paramedics finished checking his vitals, he was sitting upright again, pale, jaw tight, a thin bandage across his temple where he'd clipped the table. Low blood pressure. One of them said, shock response. You should rest. He nodded like he'd just been inconvenienced. Claire hovered beside him, whispering in sharp bursts. Numbers. Mortgage. Deadlines. I caught fragments. He wasn't hearing her. He was staring at the documents still laid out on the table. The deed. The trust summary. The insurance policy. Paper. That was all it was. Paper had just rewritten his identity. For 38 years. He'd been the heir. The future. The one the business revolved around. The one Dad trained in the garage while I washed dishes inside. Now the math said something different. Margaret stood. If you intend to contest, you may do so through counsel, she said evenly. But I advise reviewing the video before proceeding. Ethan didn't respond. His hands were shaking slightly, though he tried to hide it by gripping his knees. Claire finally looked at me. This isn't over, she said. I met her eyes. It is, I replied. Not aggressive. Not triumphant. Just factual. Ethan looked up at me then. Not angry. Not superior. Just disoriented. Like a man who'd built his entire life on a floor that had quietly been removed. And for the first time, he understood something I'd known since childhood. Inheritance isn't identity. It's just paperwork. And paperwork can change. Ethan was steadier 20 minutes later. Not strong. Not confident. Just upright. Claire had stepped out to take a call, probably with a banker. Maybe with an attorney. The room felt smaller without her voice cutting through it. It was just the three of us now. Ethan, Margaret, me. Margaret gathered the documents and gave us a professional nod. I'll leave you both a few minutes, she said. If you need me, I'm in the next office. The door closed quietly. Ethan didn't look at me at first. He stared at the grain in the mahogany table like it held instructions. You knew, he said eventually. His voice wasn't loud anymore. You had to have known. I didn't, I said. Not until last week. He swallowed. She didn't trust me. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. She trusted you. I replied evenly. With Dad's business. With the legacy. With the role you wanted. He looked up sharply. And you, he asked. I showed up. I said. That's all. His jaw flexed. You think this makes you better? No. You think you earned it? I didn't hesitate. Yes. The word didn't come from pride. It came from inventory. 2 years of chemo appointments. 2 years of night shifts. 2 years of lifting weight that no one saw. He ran a hand over his face. You don't understand the position I'm in, he said. The development in short pump, I leveraged equity against projected inheritance. I structured financing, assuming you'd get bailed out. I finished. His eyes snapped to mine. We're family. Daniel. There it was. Family? I remembered standing in the rain. I remembered the $10,000 offer. I remembered him telling me I wasn't built for the legacy. I'm not going to let you become homeless, I said calmly. Relief flickered across his face. But I'm not going to rescue you from decisions you made while treating me like I didn't belong. The relief vanished. So, what does that mean, he asked. It means you adjust, I said, the way I adjusted my entire life. He shook his head. You're walking away with $2.5 million. I'm walking away with what Mom left me. You could help. I could. I agreed. But that would teach you nothing. He stared at me like he was trying to find the younger brother he used to control. I was under pressure, he said quietly. Dad said a lot of things. Silence stretched between us. I stood. You kicked me out 2 days after the funeral. I said. You told me I wasn't built for this family. He flinched. You were wrong. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. I'm not cutting you off. I added. But if you want a relationship with me, it starts from zero, not from entitlement. He didn't answer. He couldn't. As I reached the door, he spoke once more. Daniel. I paused. Mom loved you, he said. I nodded. She loved you too, I replied. She just didn't protect you from yourself. And then I walked out. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just done. 1 month later, I sat in the office of a financial advisor Margaret recommended. Her name was Laura Bennett, 25 years in estate strategy. No flashy decor. No promises of exponential growth. Just spreadsheets and restraint. We don't touch the trust, she said, sliding a projection chart toward me. It continues compounding. You draw conservatively if needed. I nodded. The life insurance, I asked. High-yield liquidity for opportunity and emergency. And the house. She studied me for a moment. That decision shouldn't be financial. It should be psychological. She was right. I paid off my student loans that afternoon. $46,000 gone in one transfer. The weight lifted wasn't loud. It was structural. Like tightening bolts you didn't realize were loose. I didn't quit my job. Everyone assumed I would. Paramedic pay isn't glamorous. It doesn't trend online. But it's real. It's measurable. It's earned shift by shift. Money shouldn't replace who you are. It should remove fear from who you are. I switched to daytime rotations. Started sleeping normally for the first time in years. The house on Oak Hollow sat empty for 3 weeks while I decided what it meant. It wasn't just property. It was chemo mornings. Lavender wind. The driveway where my things soaked in the rain. I wasn't ready to live there. So I rented it. A young couple. 2 kids. The husband was a physical therapist. The wife worked in oncology nursing. When they asked if they could keep the lavender beds intact, I said yes. That felt right. 3 months later, I enrolled in a physician assistant program. I'd thought about it for years, expanding my scope, moving from response to diagnosis. I'd told myself it wasn't practical. Turns out, it was. The trust paid tuition quietly. No loans. No debt. I kept working part-time through school. Stayed grounded. Stayed present. Ethan sold the development in short pump at a loss. Claire filed for divorce before the year ended. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment outside the city. We spoke twice in 6 months. The first call was logistical. The second was quieter. I didn't realize how much I built my life on assumptions. He said. I didn't respond immediately. Assumptions are comfortable. They're inherited easier than money. Now you know. I said. He asked if we could get coffee sometime. I told him maybe. Not because I was punishing him. Because rebuilding takes time. The lavender bloomed again that spring. Stronger than I expected. I stood in the backyard one afternoon after a shift. Wind moving through the stems the same way it had the night of the accident. Mom used to say lavender was for protection. I think she was wrong. It's for clarity. She didn't leave me money. She left me leverage. Leverage to choose education without debt. Leverage to say no without fear. Leverage to walk away from people who confuse hierarchy with worth. Ethan wasn't a villain. He was raised inside a structure that told him he was guaranteed elevation. When that structure collapsed, he didn't know who he was without it. That's entitlement. It isn't evil. It's fragile, and fragility looks like anger when it's exposed. I don't hate my brother, but I don't carry him either. I carry my own weight. If you've ever been told you weren't built for something, a family name, a legacy, as a seat at the table, understand this. Worth isn't assigned by position. It's proven by presence. I showed up. That's what she protected. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read more than you think. And if you've ever had someone quietly plan your future when you didn't even know you needed protection, honor them by living well. That's the only repayment that matters. This story is created by the Boundaries and Bloodlines team for entertainment purposes only. All characters and events are fictionalized. Do not attempt to replicate any legal or financial actions described. Always consult licensed professionals for real-world decisions.